uh, interesting, diverse, and smart people on topics of social ontology and meta-ontology. My topic today is the question of how critical realism should think about ontological individualism. And the received view within critical realism is that individualism is not a suitable basis for the philosophy of social science. It's not a suitable basis for social ontology as the social sciences try to understand the social world. Critical realism has become an important part of the philosophy of social science, especially in the United States and also in UK. And especially among practitioners, among sociologists, critical realism has been an important force. And most critical realists are in agreement in being anti-positivist and anti-individualist. Roy Bhaskar and his followers generally emphasize the reality, the autonomy, and the rigidity of social structures. And they also advocate, as I do, a point about the reality of social mechanisms. They give a great deal of emphasis to a strong version of emergence, a version which, in the end, I think is unintelligible. And all of this is based on a determined opposition to positivism and to methodological individualism. One representative view I received through Facebook from Ruth Groff, who is an American philosopher and political scientist who has been very active in the field of critical realism in the past 10 years. But she is emphatic in writing against an earlier version of my paper that Bhaskar explicitly rejected ontological individualism in favor of a combination of what he early on called synchronic emergent powers materialism and the transformational model of social activity. So Ruth's view is that critical realism is just fundamentally opposed to ontological individualism. This, I think, is actually a mistake. It's a mistake because the arguments which Bhaskar puts forward are arguments about methodological individualism, which is fundamentally a principle about explanation. But ontological individualism does not make those assumptions about explanation, basically that the micro is the basis and the only basis for explanation of the macro. So I would say, and we'll be kind of arguing for the next 30, 40 minutes, that critical realism's rejection of reductionist individualism is unwarranted when it is directed against the position of ontological individualism. I'd like to make a comment about photographs. I find photos of important scenes, transformative scenes of social action to be especially illuminating. There's great power, I think, in photographs. And they also illustrate some of the impact of the social ontology, which is associated with ontological individualism, which is an actor-centered ontology. And each of the scenes that you see here are both important historical moments, whether in the civil rights movement or the current protests in Iran or 1956 riots and repression in Poland. In each of these instances, we see both large social structures intersecting with individuals doing things through their own agency and changing the society around them and changing history. And I think that these images also illustrate a point which I really appreciated in Asa Berman's talk yesterday about non-ideal social ontology. All of these images emphasize conflict, power, inequality, and agency on the parts of ordinary and diverse human actors. And by the way, human actors who are specified in a fairly rich way, a thick way, rather than a thin and abstract way. So what is ontological individualism? This image, by the way, is a very important moment in the history of the US labor movement. It took place only a few miles from the campus where I teach in Dearborn, Michigan, and it was an attack on Walter Reuther by the thugs, the private police force of Henry Ford's Rouge River Plant police. And in this image, you see them beating up Walter Reuther and several other associates. But what that captures is the struggle between individuals and an organization and a corporation and a larger economic system. So ontological individualism is a view about the ontological nature of social entities, structures, normative schemes, identities, and the like. This is a view that maintains that all of these social entities, they're all constituted by the actions, thoughts, and mental frameworks of individual human beings and nothing else. There is no secret sauce. There is no social essence which is larger than or has a higher causal role than human beings doing things in relationship to each other and through their own ways of thinking about the world. So on this view, the social world is constituted. It is made up by the socially situated individuals who make it up. And social actors are constituted by the locally expressed social arrangements within which they interact. This is what we can refer to as an actor-centered approach to understanding the social world. The idea that the social world is ultimately constituted by the actions, thoughts, and interactions of socially constituted and socially situated individual actors. And I think there's a resonance between that description and several of the talks which were presented yesterday. So socially constituted means that the actor's mentality, her way of thinking about the world, her motivations, identity, and modes of reasoning, all of these are formed through interactions, developmental interactions with a series of local social environments. That's the socially constituted part of the actor-centered approach. The socially situated part is what you might call the institutional location part or the constraint part in the talk we heard earlier today, that the actor's choices are influenced by the incentives, opportunities, constraints, and local culture of the institutions within which he or she acts. And finally, it is this actor-centered approach presumes that actors themselves instantiate and reproduce a whole range of social facts, normative schemes, identities, modes of behavior through their current actions and thoughts. In the previous talk, the driving on the left versus driving on the right, individuals enhance and secure social conventions, and that's part of the idea of an actor-centered approach. There's another part of this approach to understanding the social world which really needs to be emphasized, that it is a diacronic view. It is an historical view. It is an iterative view. It's the view that individuals are formed by locally embodied social facts at a certain point in time. These social facts are in turn constituted by the current characteristics of the persons who make them up at that time. And individual actors, as they develop their own agency, their own schemes of behavior and action and interpreting the world, they give force to the social power of the institutions and norms that they inhabit, whether they are norms of corporate behavior within an organization or norms of gender and race in a particular social setting. So this is an iterative view of the relationship between social influences, individual formation, individual action, and a new generation of social influences. I'm going into this amount of detail because I think it's important for addressing the question of whether critical realism should embrace ontological individualism. There are several, I find, really important consequences which are associated with this actor-centered view of social life, of the social world. First of all, this view enhances our understanding of the contingency of social change. the contingency of social action. The processes of change and development in the social world are highly contingent and path dependent, and there are no necessary laws of development, whether it's old-fashioned ideas about progress or it's Marxist ideas about revolution. No, contingency is built into the idea of an actor-centered approach to understanding the social world. But a second and really deeply important point is a point about heterogeneity, that structures on the social side and identities on the individual side, that these are path dependent, and we should expect substantial variation across time and place. And associated with heterogeneity is the idea of plasticity, that structures and identities change over time. They change as a result of local circumstances, individuals finding new ways of solving problems, new ways of engaging in conflict with each other. This image of Mussolini in Rome, fascism developed in a particular way, and the different fascisms of Europe developed in ways which were heterogeneous and different in different locales. But here's a conclusion that I would draw, which actually comes into a little bit of tension with several of the talks yesterday. This point of view provides me anyway with a basis for skepticism about essentialism in the social world and about the idea of social kinds. And so I take the view that things like fascism or authoritarian personality or gender or racial identities or religious identities like being a Muslim or being Jewish, that all of these are diverse and heterogeneous situations for individuals and for social formations. And so I'm highly doubtful about the idea that there is either an essential fascism or an essential being Black in America, being African-American in America. Rather, there is a great deal of heterogeneity across that identity. Social power. Social power seems to be an inherently social characteristic. And so I wanted to have just a minute to discuss how power fits into a social ontology based on ontological individualism. We could define power as a situation in which some individuals have access to the means of, or to some means of coercion and incentivization through which they influence the actions of others. So the notorious Elon Musk has an astonishing amount of power and leverage simply by the fact of his being the second wealthiest man in the world or person in the world. He possesses power vastly in excess of that of any of the rest of us. Some groups, though, have greater access to the levers of coercion than others. So power is not just a characteristic of individuals, but a characteristic of groups. Institutions and structures define the context in which individuals and groups have access to power. And so if we think about the Jim Crow South and the system of politics and economics and social life and enforcement through organizations like citizens' councils and the Ku Klux Klan in the American South, we can describe the institutions and structures through which behavior of African-American men, African-American women, white men and white women were structured and conferred power on these various groups, or lack of power on some of these groups. Next, we could make the observation that the acquisition and exercise of power can be analyzed, and I believe this is true, can be analyzed in the same actor-centered iterative terms described in the previous couple of slides. Economic advantage, racial disparity, gender subordination, all of these result from actors in contention and collaboration within dynamic and changing social settings. I would say parenthetically that a great deal of my thinking about social ontology does not come from philosophy. It comes from study of really gifted sociologists like the French sociologist Crozier and Turenne, the American sociologist Chuck Tilley and Michael Mann, more recently Fligstein and Doug McAdam. All of these sociologists, I believe, provide concrete analyses of the workings of power and collective action by both incumbents and challengers. And they allow us to understand in a more granular way how an actor-centered view of the world can allow us to understand relationships which are both unequal and provide power for one group or for another group. Here's kind of an important observation. Ontological individualism is not a reductionist doctrine. It is not the same as methodological individualism. Rather, it is a view about the constitution of the social world. In particular, it is entirely possible to reject reductionism, to reject an atomistic understanding of the individual actors, a kind of a pre-social understanding or a purely economistic understanding of the individual actors. It is possible to endorse the idea that social entities have real causal properties and powers, and I believe I can justify making that claim, the idea that social entities have real causal properties and powers, and to nonetheless embrace the idea that all social properties are constituted by the actions and thoughts of the actors who make them up. In other words, there is no inconsistency between the idea that social entities have, relatively speaking, autonomous causal powers and the idea that they are constituted by a myriad of social actors who behave in various ways, interact in various ways, form social relationships in various ways, in such a way as to both stabilize and sometimes change those arrangements. Furthermore, ontological individualism can be supplemented by a plausible theory of the iterative and local nature of interaction that exists between social arrangements at a certain time, the formation and shaping of individuals in a cohort, and the modification of subsequent social arrangements. In other words, this iterative and historical view of how society and individual change over time is a very important part of ontological individualism. So let's turn to critical realism. The critical realist position taken by Roy Bhaskar, Margaret Archer, Lawson. I believe that the important views which are put forward by critical realism can be fully expressed without loss within the ontological framework of ontological individualism in this kind of rich way that I've just described it. This finding enhances and I would say this finding would enhance the antecedent credibility of critical realism rather than diminishing it. In other words, this is not a criticism of critical realism. It's rather an observation which makes critical realism more credible by taking away the idea of a kind of phony emergentism, which Roy Bhaskar in particular was kind of prone to. I might add that these arguments apply with equal force to Karl Marx's own theorizing about capitalism and modes of production, which sometimes seem very macro, that it's modes of production which are guiding history rather than human beings. I remember always Marx's statement in the 18th Brumaire, people make their own history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, which I think very beautifully captures the idea of an actor-centered approach to history. I would also observe, this is an image of Durkheim, that ontological individualism is really a commonsensical view. It's a very appealing view, and it's generally conceded by even extreme social holists, or supposed social holists, such as Durkheim. Here's a statement from Rules of Sociological Method. Yet since society comprises only individuals, it seems in accordance with common sense that social life can have no other substratum than the individual consciousness. Otherwise, it would seem suspended in the air, floating in the void. Here, I would say Durkheim is formulating ontological individualism. So ontological individualism is not universally accepted, as I suppose everyone in the virtual room that we're occupying is already aware of. The most common opposition to OI comes from social holists, emergentists, who maintain that social entities like social structures, modes of production, normative systems, or institutions have durable causal properties that do not depend on facts about individuals. This is sometimes couched in terms of a strong view about emergence. But the idea of emergence is ambiguous. Weak emergence is obviously true, whereas claims of strong emergence are not even remotely credible, according to me and arguments that I've offered. Sugar is sweet. That's an emergent claim about sugar. Neither carbon or oxygen or hydrogen is sweet, but the combination is sweet. So the sweetness of sugar is an emergent property, but it is not a strongly emergent property. The idea that capitalism has its own essential dynamics of order and change, independent of the actions and thoughts and mental frameworks of the people who live within it, that is a claim about emergence, which I think could have no credible basis. But we can accomplish the same explanatory goal of wanting to acknowledge the causal importance of social entities and structures and frameworks by postulating instead relative explanatory autonomy of the social along the lines of Jerry Fodor's account of the special sciences, that the higher level sciences like psychology or biology or sociology have relative explanatory autonomy over lower level sciences, and that is a perfectly legitimate level at which to analyze the world. So a more credible, a stronger and more carefully carried out critique of ontological individualism is Brian's critique, Brian Epstein's critique. And Brian has presented this in several articles and in his book, The Ant Trap. Epstein is fundamentally skeptical, or at least he states that he is fundamentally skeptical about any conception of the social world that depends on the idea of ontological individualism, directly or indirectly. He doesn't believe that any of the received views about individuals is adequate as a basis for social metaphysics. And he offers, as we've heard now in one or two previous papers, he offers two additional ideas, which seem to be in some sense supra-individual: the idea of the grounding of a social fact and the anchoring of a social fact. And this is a very interesting set of developments in the Ant Trap and elsewhere. But here's what is noteworthy to me. This is a distinctive view from traditional thinking about the relationship between individuals and social facts. It's distinctive in the effort which it takes to formalize the semantic standing of circumstances that are intuitively crucial to social interaction. The significance of being in accordance with the rule, the significance of legitimacy or of conventionality of individual level behavior. These are points which John Searle had made about language even before Searle became a social ontologist. But this does not negate, this is my response to Brian, and I can't lay it out in a lot of detail here. This does not negate the fundamental intuition of ontological individualism. Social movements, institutions, organizations, identities, and norms are recursively constituted by cohorts of individuals over time. So with all due respect, I regard Brian's arguments in the Ant Trap as a helpful elaboration of ontological individualism rather than a refutation. And I bet that Brian is just eager to rebut this view, but I'm going to move on. So how about critical realism? What do the critical realists think about all of this? Bhaskar addresses the issue of the relationship between the micro and the macro in The Possibility of Naturalism and also in other books. And his position appears to be unequivocal. Here's a quote: "Methodological individualism is the doctrine that facts about societies and social phenomena generally are to be explained solely in terms of facts about individuals." Specifically, social events are to be explained by deducing them from the principles governing the behavior of the participating individuals and descriptions of their situation. But I would ask you to notice that this is, first of all, a simplistic understanding of methodological individualism. Not all methodological individualists would agree with that language, but most importantly, for my purposes, this is a thesis about explanation and a very singular and contestable thesis. It is not a thesis about ontology. It is not a demonstration about the, kind of the supposed complete independence of the social world from the individual actions. Chiefly, this view assumes that individualism requires abstention from social predicates, from the language which implies anything about social relationships. But from the start, there is room for us to take the view that Bhaskar rejects the explanatory and semantic dictum of individualism, but he is silent about the ontological question. And I would just note that the explanatory thesis and the semantic thesis, this is not at all applicable to ontological individualism. As I mentioned 20 minutes ago or so, the ontological individualism is completely compatible with looking at social actors as being richly constituted by social characteristics acquired through a specific history of interaction. Bhaskar himself acknowledges, as Durkheim did a few minutes ago, what he calls an important truth, quote, the idea that society is made up of or consists of only people. He seems to accept this as a trivial fact, but it is in fact the heart of ontological individualism. I skipped over he comes to an important insight, which he calls Model 3. He's given to acronyms, as you may have seen from the slides already, but Model 3 is a theory about the relationship between the individual and the social. And Model 3 is an appealing model. I would refer to it as a recursive model. And Margaret Archer, whom I'm going to discuss shortly, refers to this as the process of morphogenesis. So here's what he says about Model 3 of the relationship between individual and social. Society forms the individuals who create society. Society, in other words, produces individuals who produce society in a continuous dialectic. That kind of captures in ordinary language the cyclical process of individuals being formed, constituting social institutions, and then forming a next generation or cohort of individuals. This model of the relationship between the social world and the social individual actually seems accurate to me, and it is wholly compatible with the ontological individualism that I've sketched out. In fact, it sounds a great deal like the idea of the iterative relationship over time between social actor and social structure that is described above. But Bhaskar rejects the model. He finds it seriously misleading with a weirdly unintelligible objection. Quoting from Bhaskar, people and society are not, I shall argue, related dialectically. They do not constitute two moments of the same process. Rather, they refer to radically different kinds of things. I'm not at all sure what any part of that means, partly because I'm not very sympathetic to the idea of dialectical relationships in any case. But unfortunately, Bhaskar's preferred version, which she refers to as Model 4, goes back to the idea of a freestanding, autonomous social realm that, quote, relates to the individuals in society. Quoting from Bhaskar, metaphysically, I shall be advocating a position that I will characterize as synchronic emergent power materialism. None of these ridiculous acronyms, SEPM, that Bhaskar likes. But Bhaskar never explains the ideas invoked in this doctrine clearly or convincingly, and in particular, he never gives a clear definition or description of what he means by emergence. But as I suggested a few minutes ago, we can give a weak interpretation and a strong interpretation. He seems to mean the strong interpretation, but he never actually describes it. So I would like to suggest a fairly dramatic assessment that in other situations would lead to a lot of shoes being thrown at me at this very moment. The dramatic assessment is that Bhaskar was simply not much of a social scientist. He had very little knowledge of sophisticated sociological treatments of real social phenomena, and he was tone deaf to the iterative processes of interaction that are characteristic of real sociological processes. If Bhaskar had read Dynamics of Contention by McAdam, Tarrow, and Tilley, he would have had a much better basis for working out an ontology to be associated with critical realism. Bhaskar's comments about emergence, naturalism, and reduction all derive from a priori philosophical assumptions, and these are assumptions which largely correspond to his reading of the natural sciences. But I would say that he would have been much better sticking with Model 3, which was actually developed by a sophisticated and experienced social scientist, Peter Berger. Morphogenesis is an idea which was introduced by a more sociologically sophisticated advocate of critical realism, Margaret Archer. And so I'd like to spend a minute on morphogenesis because I think it's much more visibly compatible with ontological individualism. Archer and her collaborators employ what they call the SAC, another acronym framework, structure, action, culture. The fundamental idea here is that social processes and the mechanisms of social transformation almost always invoke each of the axes of this framework, and that influence among these three take place over time. So structures constrain and guide actions, which influence cultures, which constrain and develop the next generation of individual social actors. Archer alludes to the feature of social life, which I've emphasized earlier, the recursive relationship between actor and structure. Quoting from Archer, autonomy is also temporal. Autonomy meaning relative independence of the social. Autonomy is also temporal and temporary in the joint senses that such structural properties were neither the creation of contemporary actors nor ontologically reducible to material existence and dependent upon current acts of human instantiation for all their current effects. So she has this diacronic view of the development of social powers, of institutions and arrangements and normative schemes. But once again, I simply underline this view is entirely compatible with the ideas of ontological individualism sketched above. So we're looking towards a conclusion here. Ontological individualism is, as Durkheim recognized, almost self-evident. Socially constituted individuals constitute the social world. There is no independent social stuff that exercises influence independent from the individuals who make up a particular social arrangement. It is also clear, and I'm the first to emphasize this point, that atomistic interpretation of individuals is also unacceptable, whether it's a purely economistic understanding of individual rationality or a pre-social understanding of the individual. The idea of a pre-social or asocial conception of the individual is completely unacceptable. Rather, individuals are always socially constituted and socially situated. And the ways in which these social influences and constraints are conveyed are always through other socially situated individuals. Thus, we cannot distinguish even conceptually between the individual and her social setting. Ontological individualism does not question the undoubtable fact that individuals have social properties, beliefs, values, practices, habits, and relationships that are integral to their consciousness and agency. Second, ontological individualism does not question the fact that individuals act within the context of social structures and arrangements that are to an important degree independent from their specific actions and choices. So social structures and institutional arrangements have relative autonomy over an individual's behavior at a certain time. However, these properties and structures themselves, as the theory of morphogenesis suggests, they are the recursive manifestation of prior sets of socially constituted, socially situated individuals who have contributed to their formation as social actors. So here's the crucial point. The individual is shaped and developed by one set of arrangements and contributes to the reproduction and innovation of social arrangements through subsequent actions and thoughts. It is thus apparent to me, in any case, that the relationship between the social world and the particular constitution of human actors at a given time is recursive and iterative. Social arrangements at TI causally influence individuals at TI, actions and transformations of individuals at a later time to change these transformations of individuals lead to changes in social arrangements at the later time, and so on. So neither social arrangements nor individual constitution are temporally prior. Each is causally dependent upon the other at an earlier time period. So we can't go Hobbesian with the idea of some state of nature in which individuals had no social properties. Rather, we have to understand that individuals are always located in some set of social relationships. In this sense, the social properties are weakly emergent from the individual level processes. And this is a conclusion that is entirely compatible with a commitment to ontological individualism. This is a topic which I just love teaching and thinking about. And so I really look forward to your baffling and difficult and interesting questions and comments. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dan, for your really great talk. So we have many questions already. So Naomi?
Thank you, Dan. I couldn't change my name, so I'm not Enshma. I'm Naomi Sheeman.
And well known to me, I might add.
Yeah, from decades and decades ago. Thank you. I really like this approach, and particularly the social conception of individuals and the recursive and the iterative and so on. But I'm wondering about, well, sort of fundamental ontological questions. If one is in some very loose sense Aquinian about ontology, then the relationship between explanation and ontology comes out somewhat different. That is, I take quantitative, thou shalt not commit a priori metaphysics, that you do explanation first, and then what entities you are ontologically committed to are the ones that irreducibly figure in your explanations. And so I'm wondering to what extent the view that you're expressing is rather like a Seiderish view about, really strictly speaking, there are no tables, only microparticles arranged table-wise. Do you want to say, strictly speaking, there are, for example, no labor unions, just individual workers arranged union-wise? Which I think is wrong. I believe in a kind of emergence that I've learned from thinking about union organizers. In a way, constraints and enablements arise from becoming a particular kind of thing. So I'm more interested in unions than in, say, kinds like races or genders. And I'm wondering about what you would want to say about that is the emergence of things that figure irreducibly in explanation, and on this loosely Quinean account become part of the ontology for that reason.
Right. Those are, Naomi, thank you so much for those comments. I see them as two different comments, ontology versus explanation, and then the kind of the ontological status of higher level entities like labor unions. Let's take the explanation part first. I referred to the politics, or the kind of the sociology of contentious politics, and Chuck Tilley's work is entirely explanatory. but it's macular. What would you call it? It's granular. It's granular work. It looks down to how did the Mau Mau organize themselves? How did other organizations contribute to Mau Mau organization? How did the imperialist antagonist interact with that organization? So what Tilly is looking for is explanations that are based in social mechanisms. And he's looking for very particular social mechanisms like, collaboration and escalation and alliance formation and so forth. So what I would say about explanation is it fits very, very smoothly into this actor-centered view. We have some really good understandings of the mechanisms of, kind of person to person to group, group to group, group to person interaction. And that is the one and only source of explanation of large-scale social outcomes. So the discovery of multiple and pluralistic social mechanisms, which lead really contingently, sometimes to the success of an uprising, let's say, and sometimes to the failure. So my response about explanation is the ontology actually fits fairly well with a theory of explanation based on causal mechanisms in this kind of actor-centered view of how social mechanisms work. That's A. B, do labor unions exist? Absolutely, labor unions exist and organizations exist. I take a huge amount of solace in the fact that no material scientist ever imagined that we have to understand a metal really as just a combination of a bunch of carbon molecules or iron molecules. Rather, they're perfectly happy talking about the meso-level properties of the material. And that's what I take out of Fodor, actually, is the relative autonomy of different levels of organization. There's no reason to say that describing a metal as a metal is just a way of speaking. And really, we're just talking about an ensemble of iron and oxygen or whatever. No, a metal, a piece of copper wire is, that's a legitimate level of meso-level description of the physical world. But likewise, a labor union. Now, we can say an awful lot about a labor union. It's not one essential characteristic. It is rather, once again, we want to kind of disaggregate a little bit. Some unions are better at on-the-ground mobilization than others. Some are more prone to corruption at the top. Some are more democratic. In other words, a lot of heterogeneity across labor unions. But I would, I advocate, through very specific arguments, that it's perfectly legitimate to attribute causal powers, persistent causal powers, to meso-level entities like labor unions or gender organizations or the racial code of the Jim Crow South. That these are real things, and they're real things at the social level, but they depend on individuals doing various things, just as a metal depends on the quantum characteristics of iron and oxygen.
So there are 7 questions, so maybe if it's possible to make the questions short. Thomas? Yeah. Thomas?
Yep, I'm here. I'm just trying to start my video. Yeah, okay, I should be visible now. Thanks for a lot. That was very interesting. I've always been a bit puzzled as to what Bhaskar was up to, and now I feel that it's not my fault. But I feel that like these discussions about individualism, they go better, I feel, if we're sort of somewhat strict about trying to disentangle claims about ontological determination of facts from claims about the causal determination of facts. Like what is involved in modeling the causal processes whereby social states of affairs come around, and what is involved in just understanding what social entities consist in. And I feel one could have individualist style theses about both types of determination, but they and they might even make a nice package deal if you hold them both or something like that. But you don't have to hold them both, right? You could be in. So I think ontological individualism, in a sort of, as I would be inclined to strictly use the term, is just a claim about what things are constituted by what, sort of. So and doesn't say anything of itself about what causal processes in the social realm are like. Yeah, well, let me just leave it at that. I think these things, it's best to sort of try and keep these things sort of rigorously separated in stating a metaphysical view of the social world.
So thank you, Tomas. I like the kind of stripped down description that you gave of ontological individualism as simply a thesis about constitution, the constitution of the social. I think there's a little bit more that you can say about that, though. If you kind of amplify that into the actor-centered ontology that I described, that then also is a little bit of a hint towards explanatory strategies. Tilly, for example, rejects completely the idea that we can explain revolutions by finding characteristics which, well, for example, the thesis that democracies don't wage war against each other. So there's the idea that if a political system has the characteristic of being a representative democracy, then it also has a characteristic of not waging war. Tilly's view is that's kind of a ridiculous kind of statement. Instead, we need to disaggregate. We need to figure out what are the mechanisms within, in that case, the political institutions and the politics of different states leading to warfare or leading to revolution. So this actor-centered approach is one which says, don't go too macro. Look for meso, institutional, organizational, and individual level mechanisms which will help you kind of disaggregate into the way that different, let's say, different uprisings took place. Bread riots in E.P. Thompson and resistance to the French in James Scott. In some ways, these kinds of rebellions had some things in common, but we really need to dig into the particulars of institutional arrangements, political arrangements, and individual mentalities in order to be able to explain what a bread riot, kind of how it unfolded in England in 1600 and in Vietnam in 1945. So in other words, there is kind of a connection between the ontological commitment and then an explanatory strategy. There are two British sociologists that I really pummeled quite a bit in my book called The Scientific Marks, Hindes and Hurst, who were, they were kind of followers of Althusser, and they wrote books on pre-capitalist modes of production. But they basically wanted to make the argument, we don't really need to do a lot of historical research because Marx wrote it out. He's got a theory of the mode of production. And these structures are what determine historical outcomes. So just look into the logic of the structures. That I think is completely unacceptable. It's a bad methodology. It's a bad heuristic for finding good explanations. A much better heuristic is this kind of institutional level, actor level approach to the particulars of, colonialism or imperialism or war between states or whatever.
Yeah.
Brian, question?
Thanks, Dan. I thought this was very, very nice and interesting. There's lots I appreciate in it. I definitely like your characterization of ontological individualism as actor-centered. And I agree with your point about criticizing Bhaskar for kind of conflating methodological and ontological individualism. I think that's right. And this clarification of critical realism is really, really helpful to me. As far as I understand them, I agree that the critical realists endorse ontological individualism, or could endorse it, or ought to endorse it. But of course, as you know, I think that's so much the worse for critical realism. So I guess as I understand it, you're making kind of 2 points. One is kind of situating critical realism, pointing out what's good about it and what's problematic. And then part of your agenda, as I understand it, is to defend ontological individualism. And there, kind of you and I have a longstanding disagreement. So I just wanted to say one more thing about it to kind of provoke more defense. You've kind of generously mentioned that I've argued that ontological individualism is false. And it's not for the reasons about kind of that the social holists give, but rather that there's a different problem with ontological individualism. So the way I wanted to just kind of raise this for you is, first of all, by just noting something that I'm sure you would agree with, which is you said something very quickly about the sweetness of sugar. But the sweetness of sugar is not, of course, an emergent property of sugar molecules. It's an extrinsic property of sugar that is grounded in both sugar and in people's characteristics. So if you think about kind of what it is that makes sugar sweet, that's grounded in part by stuff about sugar and part in stuff about people. And now, just as an example that we've already seen today, think about Catherine's characterization of hegemonic, the hegemonic kind of gender, right? Now, that's partly grounded by stuff about social practices and so on, but Catherine was very explicit that part of that is grounded by constraints in our built environment. And that is anti-individualistic. So there's a very straightforward account that we've already seen today of a social property where there are individualistic grounds and there are non-individualistic grounds. And that's not the case in which the non-individualistic grounds are somehow part of what determines the gender characteristics because they're filtered through the psychology of individuals. That's not her account. Her account is no. Part of it is that there's built environments, and that's the fact that you go into Bloomingdale's and there is a pink department and a blue department. That is part, that clothes are literally arranged in two parts. That is part of what grounds hegemonic gender, and that's not individualistic. So that's kind of, in short, I think a clear example of a failure of ontological individualism for a social category.
So that's really intriguing to me, Brian, because if you push back one step, Bloomingdale's has the pink and blue, or the city of Chicago became the great metropolis because in each case, because of a set of needs, interests, and interpretations of actors at the time. In the case of the city of Chicago, it was the fact that the great rail magnates, were basically competing over what the rail network ought to look like, and Chicago won. So that's an actor-centered explanation of how the built environment 50 years later was itself the consequence of actors' conflict and struggle and kind of accommodation. We could tell a similar story, I think, about the Bloomingdale's. Why is it blue and pink? Well, it's kind of a marketing, it's a marketing strategy. So some genius moron, let's call it, or moronic genius, got the idea we can sell more baby clothes if we can increase the idea that, female babies ought to have one color and male babies ought to have the other color. Altogether, there's going to be more demand for clothing. So what a great idea. In other words, we can explain that innovation, at phase 2 of the built environment on the basis of calculations which occurred and accommodations which occurred and struggles which occurred in phase 1 of the environment. Once you start thinking along those lines, you could probably think of zillions of ways in which American culture has been deformed by marketing innovations that really made our country much, much worse. 5 billion sold, the slogan for McDonald's. How many people have we killed by selling another 5 trillion quarter pounders? Marketing genius has changed the built environment, but it's not difficult to give an actor-centered explanation of how that occurred. So at one stage in history, it's just a solid extra individual fact. There's a rail network, there's a Bloomingdale's practice, there's a McDonald's marketing strategy, but push it back a level, and it's a series of choices and struggles and contention occurring among actors, which led to this outcome rather than that outcome. I even see the struggle between Mastodon and Twitter as being a similar opportunity right now. But anyway, I won't go into that.
I have some responses, but let's go on to the next person.
Matt?
Brian snaked my question. I'm just going to continue on and say, Daniel, what if we changed the example from the built environment to the natural environment? So we can't appeal to individualist explanations of what's created the natural environment.
Sure.
Today's natural environment is something that is heavily modified by human activity, but go back 1,000 years and, the path of a local river, forms an important part of the social world. Perhaps it has religious significance. It informs how we do our agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. That seems like an important part of our social world that's not constituted by individualists, by individuals rather.
Right.
And so one thing that puzzles me about ontological individualism is I've always thought of it as like opposed to spooky structures that exist independently of us, but that, natural environment seems like the kind of thing that ontological individualists should just be like, okay, so we're not proper individualists. We just accept that there's a built and a natural environment out there too, but that's not against the spirit of individualism, is it?
Right. Well, I think that is kind of the response I'd like to make, that the fact that we live on a planet that has a solid surface, it's not all ocean, has implied, basically a different set of opportunities for human ecology and so forth. So of course it's true that human development, human action, the fact of climate change. Now, of course, climate change is a tricky part because it's mostly human intervention at this point, which has led to these horrible outcomes. But let's say that the rain situation in California were actually the result of a volcano or something. That would be a circumstance, extra individual circumstance, which led possibly to long-term major change of urbanization, let's say. So yeah, I take it as entirely true that the physical environment in which individual, societies, social individuals make their lives, that's what's true about Marxist materialism, really. It's we satisfy our needs by dealing with a natural environment, and there are certain opportunities created by an environment that allow us to do certain kinds of things we couldn't do in a different environment. So I take that point. I don't think it detracts from, because the real argument is, are social structures, strongly emergent, and do they eventually govern individuals? That's kind of I'm trying to put it as crudely and as strongly as I can. And that's the thesis that I'm denying.
Asia, you have a question?
Great. Thanks so much, Daniel. I really enjoyed the talk. So I was going to ask a question of clarification about strong emergence, but I think I'll just follow up on this really interesting exchange that Brian started. So as I understood your response to Brian, you wanted to say that the built environment itself depends on us. And so the fact that these hegemonic gender kinds depend on the built environment is not a counterexample to ontological individualism. But it seems to me that the sense in which the built environment depends on us is causal, right? So, I mean, as you said, our beliefs and attitudes and what have you cause us to organize, department stores in a certain way, such that women's clothes are in a certain place, say. So that's a causal sort of dependence. But one might think with Brian that we should understand ontological individualism as a thesis about metaphysical dependence or grounding, or if you don't like grounding, just say metaphysical dependence and not causal dependence. But then it seems like the counterexample isn't answered by saying, well, the built environment causally depends on us because what's at issue is metaphysical dependence, not causal dependence.
So I actually think that it's all about causal dependence. How did we get here with Bloomingdale's in pink and red, or pink and blue? We got here historically, and what is, who can write the history of American marketing and department stores, which can explain to us how these oppressive gender norms got written into the way in which you enter into a Bloomingdale's and wind up in this department or that department. I think the only kind of story we can tell is a kind of historical causal story. There was a set of interests which companies had. You're in the UK, right?
I'm in Vienna.
Oh, you're in Vienna. Okay. It may not be true in grocery stores in Vienna, but in the United States, the dairy products are always in the same place. And that seems a little bit weird. Why is that? But it turns out there's a whole big marketing theory maximizing the sale of dairy products because everybody needs milk, and therefore putting the milk in the furthest corner of the store leads consumers past lots of other things they might buy, but they wouldn't have thought to buy. In other words, opportunistic decision-making led to the geography of a grocery store. And I think that's an interesting, it's an interesting fact. It is kind of ontological because it says grocery stores didn't fall out of the sky. They were designed by human beings, opportunistic human beings, trying to accomplish certain things like maximizing profits. But it's a causal story, and it also has ontological implications. The implication being that it's individuals. It's not, it's not out of the Quran. It's not out of the essence of the world. It's just you can sell a lot more product if you put the dairy products in the far corner of the store.
I think there are a lot of other questions, so I think I should.
You probably think
there.
that's a ridiculously mundane answer to your really good question, but it's the way I would go on it.
Matti, you have a question?
Yeah, my question relates to your defense of ontological individualism and I guess the rejection of atomism. And in a conference on the metaphysics of social ontology, what I'm about to say sort of seems doubly wrong, but seems to me that philosophers in general, they spend a lot too much time worrying about ontology, and often it's more interesting what sort of explanations and predictions and counterfactuals and so forth we can formulate. And I guess as someone who knows a lot about social scientific practice, you would agree with that. So if I reflect back on my own talk, sort of with respect to the practice of theoretical modeling, I think that models, they don't involve very many ontological commitments at all. And here I'm, of course, talking about the first, not the second stage of model-based science. And Tillis and McAdams' work is different because they, of course, draw on a rich variety of empirical case studies and so forth. So they don't, their work doesn't exhibit this type of strategy. However, the question I wanted to ask is what actually follows methodologically from the rejection of atomism, or the idea that individuals are in a dynamic relationship with their social environment, and whether it might nevertheless sometimes be methodologically legitimate to use certain types of modeling conventions or other methods such as agent-based modeling that appear to be quite atomistic.
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Matti. The view that I believe is that ontology matters. In fact, I think maybe, Brian, you had an essay called on why ontology matters or something like that, or at least you were in the debate But it matters because what we assume about the nature of the social world in some way guides the research hypotheses that we are inclined to come up with. I think this is especially true in the area of critical realism, because critical realists have been kind of seduced by the lofty emergentism of Roy Bhaskar, the state and the economic system and the mode of production. These entities are reified, and then they're given a kind of life within the mind, which leads to hypotheses and attempts to explain things and whatnot. But from my point of view, that's a huge mistake, because reification is a huge mistake. Reification leads to overlooking the fact of heterogeneity, plasticity, and contingency. The many capitalisms debate, for example, there's the idea that Marx had the idea, once you've got capitalism, you've got X, Y, Z as consequences. But many people studying capitalism since 1960 have come to see that Japanese capitalism, French capitalism, US capitalism, they all have somewhat different institutional realizations. They're heterogeneous. Well, if you're too wedded to the idea of high-level structures being the most important thing, then you're not going to pay attention to those differences across national instances. Whereas if you have this kind of actor-centered, institution-centered view that emphasizes heterogeneity, contingency, and plasticity, then you're going to be more like Chuck Tilley, looking for meso-level explanations and more granular accounts of racism and gender oppression and capitalist expansion and you name it, a whole series of things. So in other words, ontology matters for critical realists in particular, because I think they're often led to formulate hypotheses which are just not credible on their face once you realize, wait, we're talking about a world that is made by and constituted by socially situated, socially constituted human actors. We wouldn't think that way. And we wouldn't think about capitalism being the directive, essential thing that is in common between Britain and Japan and the United States. We wouldn't think that if we weren't reifying and kind of imagining a social ontology that puts the capitalist mode of production first.
Muhammad Ali, you have a question?
Yeah, maybe this is a slightly different attempt to push back against ontological individualism, if everyone's not sick of that already. But so if it says that society is constituted by individual social actors, that doesn't sound to me like a very interesting ontological claim. It's not more interesting, for instance, than saying that society is constituted by elementary particles. It's all quarks and leptons, right? The more interesting claim, it seems to me, is the one that you made along the way, which is that social entities have real causal properties and causal powers. And that to me sounds like an ontological claim. It's not just a methodological or epistemological claim. Ontology isn't just about constitution. If you're interested in not so much in addition to being interested in individuals, you're interested in kinds. What you're interested in is what are the causal powers and causal properties. And I would say that, at least on one understanding, does correspond to a kind of ontological or metaphysical emergence. It's saying that the social world is not just additive or aggregative. So it's less like the relationship of, say, a heap of sand to the grains, and more like the relationship that you mentioned of the sugar molecule to the hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon. So it could have turned out differently, but it turns out that yeah, there are these social structures that have self-standing causal powers. And that sounds to me a lot like a denial of ontological individualism, at least in the interesting sense.
Well, I guess we just disagree about that. You began by saying that ontological individualism is no more interesting than quantum fundamentalism, that everything is constituted by quantum particles, fundamental physics. Ontological individualism actually is more interesting than physicalism for the purpose of the social sciences. We can explain nothing about the social world by dropping to the level of subatomic particles. We can explain a lot. In fact, I would say we can explain virtually everything by a properly constituted inquiry that's framed around socially constituted, socially situated individuals in relationship, having thoughts and mental frameworks, and doing various things. There's a very productive relationship between that level of, kind of disarticulating, I suppose you might say, between that level of individual identity and the social outcomes that we're interested in. So we can get nothing from the fact that 80% of your body is composed of water. It's not an interesting fact about you or me, but it is a very interesting fact that you and I have, in some ways a shared history, in some ways a different history. Our identities, in some ways, share some. I'm just speculating. I'm just making it up, really. Some features in common, some ways in which we're different. And when we consider particular outcomes, let's say institutional struggles in a university, how do we form alliances and how do we bring pressure to bear on a bad president of the university? Well, an actor-centered approach says, well, let's try to figure out what are the resources that are available, what are the motivations, what are the identities. We're talking about the assault on pension rights in Great Britain right now, and not every effort at collective action succeeds. That's one of the reasons why the study of contentious politics is so interesting. We have to figure out at kind of the level of actors and their organizations, what features lead to successful collective action and which fail. In other words, I think there's a very strong connection between the ontology and our ability to have good explanations of outcomes.
So thank you very much, Dan and everyone for the questions. So let's have a 5-minute break. So let's meet again